I'm about to share something that might shock you. 70% of family inheritances destroy relationships forever. Not damage them. Destroy them. And the saddest part? Most of these conflicts could be avoided with biblical wisdom that's been available for thousands of years. Right now, somewhere in your city, siblings who grew up sharing bedrooms aren't speaking to each other. Cousins who played together every summer cross the street to avoid eye contact. All because of money they didn't even earn themselves. This is the inheritance curse that nobody talks about. But here's what gives me hope. The Bible addresses this exact issue with profound clarity. And when families apply these principles, something miraculous happens. They don't just preserve their relationships. They actually grow closer through the process. Let me start by telling you about the most common trait I see in inheritance conflicts. It's not greed, though that's what most people assume. The real culprit is something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It's the belief that inheritance equals love. Think about it this way. When a parent passes away, adult children often measure their worth by what they receive. If my brother got the house and I got the car, does that mean mom loved him more? If my sister was named executor, does that mean dad trusted her more than me? These questions poison everything. The Bible speaks directly to this in the parable of the prodigal son. Remember how the older brother reacted when his wayward sibling returned? He didn't celebrate. He calculated. He measured his father's love in material terms. And that mindset created bitterness that nearly destroyed their family. Here's the second trait that appears in almost every inheritance dispute. Selective memory about who did what for the parents. One sibling remembers driving mom to doctor's appointments every week. Another remembers paying for dad's medications. A third remembers being there emotionally when everyone else was too busy. And you know what? They're probably all right. But when inheritance becomes the scoreboard, every act of love gets retroactively converted into a transaction. The sister who moved back home to care for aging parents feels she deserves more. The brother who helped financially believes his contribution was greater. The daughter who provided emotional support thinks her sacrifice was the most valuable. This is where Proverbs 15:27 cuts straight to the heart. Whoever is greedy for unjust gain troubles his own household. Notice it doesn't say troubles other people's households. It says his own. When we approach inheritance with a transactional mindset, we're the ones who suffer most. The third common trait might surprise you. It's the involvement of spouses who weren't part of the original family. I've watched countless inheritance conflicts escalate because a son-in-law or daughter-in-law whispered in their spouse's ear about fairness and legal rights. Now, I'm not saying spouses are always the problem. But when someone who didn't grow up in the family starts interpreting every decision through a lens of financial strategy rather than family history, trouble follows. They don't remember grandma's stories about why certain items matter. They see dollar signs where their spouse sees memories. The Bible addresses this too. In Genesis, we see how family conflicts intensify when in-laws get involved. Think about Jacob and Laban. Think about the tension between Sarah and Hagar. These weren't just ancient stories. They're warnings about what happens when family boundaries get blurred during times of transition. Here's the fourth trait, and this one breaks my heart every time. Siblings fighting over inheritance often have unresolved conflicts from childhood that have nothing to do with money. The inheritance dispute becomes a proxy war for decades of perceived slights and favoritism. Maybe one sibling always felt like the golden child got everything. Maybe another felt invisible compared to the high achiever. Maybe there was a family secret that created division years ago. When parents die, all these buried wounds resurface. And suddenly the fight isn't really about who gets the china cabinet. Jesus spoke about this in Matthew 5:23-24. If you're offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift. Notice the priority. Reconciliation comes before everything else, even worship. The fifth trait I see constantly is poor communication before the crisis hits. Parents avoid difficult conversations about inheritance because they don't want to think about death. Adult children avoid asking questions because it feels greedy or morbid. So everyone stays silent until it's too late. Then the will gets read, and someone is shocked. Someone feels betrayed. Someone discovers a decision was made years ago that they never knew about. And because there's no opportunity to ask mom or dad why they chose what they chose, siblings fill in the blanks with their worst assumptions. Proverbs 18:13 warns us about this. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. How many inheritance conflicts could be prevented if families simply talked openly while everyone is still alive? How many relationships could be saved with honest conversations about expectations and intentions? The sixth common trait is what I call the entitlement mindset. Some siblings believe they deserve a certain inheritance simply because they exist. They've counted on that money for their retirement. They've made financial plans based on assumptions. And when reality doesn't match their expectations, they feel robbed. But here's a hard truth from Scripture. Children aren't entitled to their parents' wealth. 1 Timothy 5:8 says that anyone who doesn't provide for their own household has denied the faith. Parents have a responsibility to care for their children while raising them. But adult children have a responsibility to provide for themselves. When we approach inheritance with gratitude rather than entitlement, everything changes. Instead of asking what do I deserve, we ask what has been graciously given. Instead of comparing our portion to our siblings, we thank God for any blessing we receive. This shift in perspective is revolutionary. The seventh trait appears in families where one sibling has significantly more financial need than others. Maybe they're struggling with medical bills. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they made poor financial decisions earlier in life. And they're counting on inheritance to rescue them. This creates a terrible dynamic. The struggling sibling feels desperate. The financially stable siblings feel resentful if the inheritance gets divided unequally to help. Parents feel torn between equal distribution and meeting genuine need. There's no easy answer, but there is biblical wisdom. 2 Corinthians 8:13-14 talks about equality and fairness in the context of giving. The goal isn't that others should have relief while you have hardship, but that by equality your abundance supplies their need. Notice the emphasis on community and mutual care rather than rigid equality. Here's the eighth trait that destroys families. The inability to separate sentimental value from monetary value. One sibling wants grandma's ring because she remembers grandma wearing it. Another wants it because it's worth $10,000. Both claims feel valid to the person making them, but they're fundamentally different. This is where families need the wisdom of Solomon. Remember when two women claimed the same baby? Solomon proposed cutting the baby in half. The real mother immediately offered to give up her claim to save the child's life. The impostor agreed to the division. When we truly love something or someone, we're willing to sacrifice for it. If you genuinely treasure an item for sentimental reasons, you'd rather see your sibling have it than see the relationship destroyed. If you're only thinking about monetary value, you'll fight to the death for your share. The ninth common trait is the absence of a neutral mediator. When siblings try to divide an estate among themselves, emotions run too high. Everyone has their own perspective. Everyone feels their claim is most valid. What families need is someone who can speak truth without personal stake in the outcome. This is actually a biblical principle. Proverbs 11:14 tells us that in an abundance of counselors there is safety. When families bring in a trusted pastor, a family friend, or a professional mediator who understands both legal and spiritual principles, conflicts often resolve much more peacefully. But here's the key. The mediator must be chosen before conflict erupts, and all parties must agree to respect their guidance. Waiting until siblings aren't speaking to each other makes mediation nearly impossible. Planning ahead makes all the difference. The 10th trait I see in inheritance conflicts is the failure to consider eternal perspective. Siblings get so focused on earthly possessions that they forget what Jesus said in Matthew 6:19-20. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. What's the treasure in heaven? Relationships built on love. Forgiveness extended when it wasn't deserved. Unity preserved when division seemed inevitable. Grace given when justice could have been demanded. These are the things that last forever. I've watched families sacrifice decades of relationship for a few $1,000s. I've seen siblings stop speaking over furniture that will end up in a garage sale anyway. And I've wondered, what would they choose if they could see 50 years into the future? Would the money still seem worth it? Here's what biblical wisdom teaches us about navigating inheritance conflicts. First, start the conversation while parents are still alive. Don't wait for the crisis. Ask questions. Share concerns. Discuss expectations. Give parents the opportunity to explain their reasoning and hear their children's perspectives. Second, separate your identity from your inheritance. Your worth isn't determined by what you receive. Your parents' love isn't measured in dollar signs. You are valuable because you are made in God's image, not because of what you might inherit. Third, practice generosity before you're forced to. If you can be generous with your siblings now, you'll find it easier to be generous during inheritance division. If you're constantly keeping score and demanding equality, that pattern will intensify under stress. Fourth, get your own financial house in order. Don't count on inheritance for your security. Plan as if you'll receive nothing, and be grateful for anything you do receive. This removes the desperation that fuels so many conflicts. Fifth, prioritize relationship over stuff. Every single time. If you have to choose between getting your fair share and preserving your relationship with your sister, choose your sister. Things are temporary. People are eternal. Sixth, practice forgiveness in advance. Decide now that you'll extend grace when your siblings make decisions you disagree with. Commit now to assuming the best rather than the worst. Choose now to let go of old wounds rather than weaponizing them during inheritance discussions. Seventh, remember that God owns everything anyway. Psalm 24:1 says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. You don't really own anything. You're a steward of what God has entrusted to you. This perspective changes everything about how you approach inheritance. Let me close with this truth. The greatest inheritance you can receive isn't money or property. It's a family that loves each other. It's siblings who still gather for holidays. It's cousins who let their children play together. It's a legacy of unity that gets passed down through generations. When you stand before God, He won't ask how much you inherited. He'll ask what you did with what you received. He'll ask whether you loved your siblings well. He'll ask whether you chose peace over possessions. And in that moment, you'll be so grateful for every time you chose relationship over stuff. The Bible gives us everything we need to navigate inheritance conflicts with grace. The question is whether we'll have the courage to apply it. Whether we'll value eternal things over temporary things. Whether we'll trust God's provision more than we trust our own claims to fairness. Your family's story doesn't have to end in division. With biblical wisdom, honest communication, and a commitment to love, you can navigate inheritance in a way that actually brings your family closer together. That's the real inheritance worth fighting for.